Welcome to In the East Wing. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking to Kathy Gannon. Kathy is a Canadian journalist who has been covering Afghanistan since the 1980s. She is well informed about the country's history, politics, and culture. Whilst in Afghanistan, Kathy once survived a fatal attack that led to the killing of her friend, Anya, whom she was very close with. The incident, however, did not stop Kathy from keeping her passion alive, for she is still doing what she does best. When talking about her experiences, Kathy speaks with so much empathy and understanding, and it is certainly an honor to have her on the East Wing. Thank you for doing this with me, and you are going to be my first conversation on this brand new podcast that I'm launching with WKNC, so thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you for asking.
Absolutely. I remember the first time I encountered or came across your profile, I saw a picture of you with a laptop and I think a candle on the side, and it looked very dark and quite dim. And the minute I saw that picture, I immediately thought about the days I spent in Libya when we suffered with tremendous power outages and power cuts, and you'd always have candles in the house, and you hear, I don't know, like factions shelling one another, you hear bombs dropping, and it's just I saw that picture and I was like, gosh, it reminds me of those days. And so I wanted to ask you about the context of that picture and what where does it go back to?
That was 2001. The Taliban were still in power, and the U.S.-led coalition had already, the invasion had begun on October 7th. And I was the only Western journalist that the Taliban let back into Afghanistan while they were still there and before they were thrown out by the U.S.-led coalition. So I went back on October 23rd. They left Kabul on November 13th of 2001. The Taliban were driven out on November 13th, 2001. So I went back on October 23rd. So I was the only Western journalist there for a couple of weeks. The BBC was allowed back in the last couple of days, but I was the only Westerner there. And this was at night at the AP house in the basement. And we'd moved down to the basement because our office and house where we were on the top floor. Well, there was a lot of bombing, and especially at night. And plus you weren't allowed, the lights were all turned off. The Taliban had turned off all the power that existed. There wasn't complete power anyway, but they turned off all the power during the evening, thinking that they would somehow make it more difficult for the Americans to bomb their territory, not realizing that they really didn't need lights. But anyway, so they would turn off all the lights, and so all the power would be off. So you couldn't have lights on in your office because it would be seen outside. So even candles, or we had a generator, and we also had sat phones, which is how we transmitted. So I moved everything down into the basement, and plus also the bombing was quite heavy, and it got closer and closer into the city because there were military bases in Kabul itself. So the bombing was quite heavy, and the U.S. was using B-52s. B-52s are not particularly accurate aircraft bombing runs, so it's quite random what would happen. So we were down in the basement, and the only power we had was this candle, and I had a sat phone, which we used the generator for to run the sat phone when I filed. So that was me down in the basement. Others that worked with AP, my Afghan colleagues were there. Amr Shah was there. We had our other staff were there. They were so afraid they were just sort of like hugging the walls. But
Oh my God.
so that's where I was at the time.
And usually when you guys, when you enter or when you exit the basement or your area of operations, what do you carry with you? Is there something that you consistently have within easy reach, or does that change every now and again?
No, my notebook, maybe. I mean,
Mm.
not really. I mean, we were in the house. We went upstairs to get things. I slept upstairs. I was filing from downstairs in the basement. But I still slept upstairs. We went up to the living area. So it wasn't like we were holed up down in the basement. During the day, the bombing was a little further out, so we were upstairs. The light was coming in. We were able to use that. And the bombing was much heavier in the late afternoon and nighttime, at least around Kabul.
Oh.
So yeah. So during the day, we were mostly upstairs, and then toward the end, the last day before the Taliban were driven out of Kabul. The Americans did hit the house right behind us with a 2,000-pound bomb, and at that point, I
Oh.
was upstairs. Yeah, that was pretty harsh. So I went flying across the room, and the windows were blown in, and the frames, everything. And so we left the building then to go up to the intercon. And the BBC by this time were also in Kabul. So it was like the night before the Taliban actually fled Kabul. And the Americans were aiming for the house behind us, which they hit, but it was a Taliban leader who later was killed. But anyway, he wasn't in the building. He wasn't in the house at the time.
Mm.
But anyway, so we left, but our basement was still intact. And so there were some women and children fleeing in the neighborhood because of course it's terrifying. There's smoke everywhere, and it's people are there, civilians are there. And so we hustled them into the office and put them downstairs in the basement. And our driver, who was really Abdullah, stayed down in the basement because the basement was still intact. And we went up toward the intercon, somehow thinking that that might be safer, and communication. And where we were in Kabul at the time, in Wazir Akbar Khan, was a very heavy, there was a lot of Arab fighters that were in that area. So we knew that that was a heavily targeted area as well. So we thought, okay, we'll get out of that area. Anyway, and so moved quickly to the intercon. There was
Mm.
just one van we went back, got the BBC folks, they jumped in, and we all headed up to the intercon. Took us a while to get there. There were a lot of roadblocks and yeah, a lot
Gosh.
of problems along the way, but we made it.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things I noticed in the story is that you mentioned a 2,000-pound bomb being dropped, and it got me
Mm.
thinking. I mean, wouldn't it have been wiser to go for maybe a precision-guided missile or something more less impactful in a way, since it was a target that was since it was one target, right? One Taliban leader, or yeah, I just thought that might have been an option, or a better option in a way.
Yeah, I'm not a military person, so
Hmm.
I'm not going to I'm assuming that you asked about why use the 2000, why not something more directed. You froze there for a moment.
Yeah.
Um, I think they at in Afghanistan, certainly using B-52s in a urban area is not a I would think, because it is so random. It's not really the type of weapon that you use in an urban setting.
Mm.
I think certainly in Kabul in Afghanistan, the intelligence really was not that great in terms of the US or NATO, because really they hadn't been in Afghanistan during the whole time the Taliban were there. Even after 92, when the Mujahedeen were in Kabul,
Yeah.
the ones who were backed by the US to fight the former Soviet Union, they were pretty much, everybody had pretty much left them alone. They were fighting each other, and then the Taliban came in. So really, the West hadn't been that engaged in Afghanistan, except for wanting Osama bin Laden. But even at that, their level of intelligence abilities in Afghanistan were fairly limited. So I don't know that they would have been able to pinpoint in that great with that great an accuracy anyway, frankly. So
Mm.
I'm not really sure that their intelligence was that good. I mean,
Yeah.
they fired at Osama, the eastern Afghanistan in 1998, um, when Clinton was in. Um, and they were trying to hit a base in eastern Afghanistan and host, and where Osama used to frequent, and then Bin Laden used to frequent, and they, they missed him, and
Mm.
they killed some Pakistani militants actually, and a
Ugh.
couple of chickens.
When you mentioned the Mujahedeen, the first thing that came to my mind was this one guy that I always encountered when I was a kid back home in Libya. He lived in next to my grandma's house, and whenever my family and I would go to our grandma's house and we would play in the street, out in the streets back when there weren't any smartphones, or things that would keep us busy in the house, we would always see this guy outside in at night, and he had and I'll never forget this guy. His name is Al Amin. He had a huge beard, and he would always tell us, kids, don't play out in the streets at night. And that was the only thing that he would utter. He wouldn't bother us. He wouldn't do anything that was sort of nefarious, but that's the thing that he would always tell us. And when we go back to my grandma's house, we would tell our aunts and our grandma that this guy talked to us again and he told us not to play in the streets. And they would tell us that Al Amin is a nice guy, but he went through so much as part of the Mujahedeen in Afghanistan. He actually was a fighter back in, during the Soviet Afghan war. And so, Afghanistan to me was always at the back of my mind and until, I sort of grew up and started learning more about the country. But you, Miss Gannon, you've been covering Afghanistan since the 80s. So you've witnessed I guess the whole, the war between the Mujahideen and the Soviets, right? I mean, how or why did that start? It's such a interesting,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it started after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, but it was the height of the Cold War
Hmm.
as well. And so, really, the Mujahideen became proxies for the United States against the Soviet Union, and they were the staging arena was Pakistan. And at the time, it was a military dictator in Pakistan, Zia Haq. And Ziaul Haq was a very, he had just thrown out Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the prime minister, who was a progressive and a liberal leader. And Ziaul Haq was a very rigid Islamic ideologue.
Hmm.
And so he's the one that invited a lot of the sent out the invitation to all the countries, the Muslim countries and Arab countries, to please come and fight against the Soviet Union. But to be clear, the United States was an equal partner in this,
Hmm.
and all of the Afghan leaders and the non-Afghans, many from Arabic-speaking countries, were supported in large part by the United States. Uh, by the Western countries. Surreptitiously, a lot of the weapons came through Egypt, but a lot of the support, the US was a partner with Pakistan in this. This was
Hmm.
not, certainly Pakistan played a big role. It was a staging arena, but the US was a big partner. It was at the height of the Cold War. They really wanted to go after the Soviet Union for their invasion of Afghanistan in 79. And Ronald Reagan invited these Mujahideen groups to Washington at one point. He's the one that dubbed them freedom fighters.
Right.
He's and there was a real outflowing of refugees into Pakistan, and it was a U.S. university, and I want to say the University of can't remember right now
That's all
because I
right.
know it's in my But
No, I'm saying it's
you
all
know,
right.
oh
You'll
yeah,
remember it.
I thought you knew the one. But anyway, American University that set up a program for teaching Afghan refugees English.
Ah,
And it was, and this is where the title of my book comes from, but it was to teach them English. J is for jihad, to fight the communists. K is for Kalashnikov, to use in your jihad against the communists.
oh,
And they would have math questions for them. And it would be, if you had 10 communists and you killed 5 communists, how many communists would you have left? So that was used in the refugee camps in northwestern Pakistan, the Afghan refugee camps. So to be clear, the U.S. was very much behind capitalizing on that Islamic fervor to use it as the motivation behind fighting the godless communists. And Ronald Reagan, who was then president in the United States, used that very term, saying, the godless communists and these freedom fighters are fighting, to preserve God and country. And so it was very much the use of that in terms of as incentives
mm,
toward fighting the former Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and who had invaded to prop up the communist government, the pro Moscow government that was there. And then
yeah.
there was a lot of talk that it was because the Soviets went in because they wanted a warm water port. They wanted to get through to southern Pakistan, blah blah. So I mean, how the rationale behind that, whether that was their goal or whether they were just worried. They came in because they didn't want their southern belly to be. They wanted an ally in Kabul, against in a strategic part for them, because of course it was the former Soviet Union, so all the Central Asian states were part of the former Soviet Union, until Gorbachev then came up with the um, it changed later, and of course, Ronald Reagan took credit for the breakup of the Soviet Union. But so really, Afghanistan, if you think about it, was the last real big Cold War
Yeah.
battle. So there was a lot of fervor, and they really capitalized on that Islamic fervor to motivate the Mujahedeen. And the Mujahideen were in Pakistan. The groups, they were divided into 7 groups, and the majority of the money and the weapons went to the most restrictive of the groups,
Oh my.
the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar groups, even Ahmed Shah Massoud. He was not a moderate by any stretch of the imagination. Yunus Khalis, the more moderate groups, the more progressive groups like the Geilanis or even Mujahedeen, who Hamid Karzai was associated with, they barely got any money and they barely got any weapons. The real bulk of the weapons and support went to the most uh, um, religiously
Mm,
restrictive groups. Was very close to the Arabs, the Saudis. He was very, very close with the Saudis, and Hekmatyar was very, very close with them. Obviously, the Haqqanis,
Haqqani, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I know now people know the word, the name. But anyway, so they got all the weapons and the money, and actually Jalaluddin Haqqani, Sirajuddin Haqqani's father, was very close with the United States, and during that time, and there certainly was a lot of support for him within the CIA
Right.
at the time when they were funding and sending money into Afghanistan to fight against the former Soviet Union. He was very strong. But you have to understand that a lot of these, whether it's Sayyaf, who was very, very close with the Saudis, and with many in Al Qaeda, Sayyaf ran training camps. And then the Mujahideen took power in 1992. The Soviet Union left in 89,
Hmm.
February 1989. And in 1990, of course, the Berlin Wall fell down, collapsed, and the former Soviet Union disintegrated, and Ronald Reagan took credit for it. And the Mujahideen, I have to tell you, also took credit for it, and they still do.
Gosh.
So, and then when the U.S. Left in 2021, they again said, see, we defeated the first
Mm-hmm.
superpower, now we defeated the second. But anyway,
And you were there
so I,
from the 80s, right? You were involved as a war
yes,
correspondent.
yes, as a matter of fact, I was in Afghanistan from, I mean, off and on, but from 80s, I think the first time I went was 86, just before the US gave the Mujahideen Stinger missiles. And it
Oh.
was the Stinger missiles that actually turned the war around, because before the Stingers, the Soviet aircraft could come in very low, because I remember going in with the Mujahideen, and they came in so low that you could actually see the face of the pilot. I mean,
Oh
I
my
mean, we were in the
goodness.
mountains, mind you, but they were coming in so low, or the helicopter gunships could come in so low. Once the Stingers were given to the Mujahideen, um, they then had to stay above 20,000. I think it was 20,000 or 22,000 feet, the aircraft, because any lower and the Stingers could hit them. So
Mm.
that really helped turn the war around, really. And that was in, I think, the fall of 86. The Stingers were given to the Mujahideen, many of who later sold them, I have to say, to some to Iran, some to anyway.
God.
and then the Americans had a buyback program later. Anyway, so that really turned the war around in 86. Gorbachev had a year of what was called a scorched earth policy,
Hmm.
where they just pounded the hell out of Afghanistan, the east of Afghanistan, the south of Afghanistan, and refugees came out in large numbers. I remember being in the mountains, and they dropped napalm, a lot of napalm on the mountains, which is a horrific weapon, because, of course, it burns your skin, and it also destroys everything in its field. But
Gosh.
when that didn't work, they then started to negotiate a withdrawal, the Soviet Union, and they had these proximity talks, which they held with the Mujahideen, with the Americans, and anyway, and in the end,
Mm.
they came up with an agreement to leave, and a slow withdrawal that the last one withdrew. I think it was February 15th, 1989.
Yeah.
And then the pro-Moscow government of Najib, he lasted for another 3 years. Everybody thought he would collapse as soon as the Soviet Union left. But in fact, he lasted for another 3 years, because the Soviet Union left a lot of weapons and whatnot. But anyway, he lasted for another 3 years. And then the Mujahideen went in 92. So that would be like Hekmatyar, Emmett Shah Massoud, Rabbani, Sayoff, Fahim, all these people who the Americans would later bring back in 2001, all of whom were crooks, I have to say,
Warlords, right?
um, and proved themselves to be very corrupt. And they started fighting among each other for power from 92 to 96, because and a lot of fighters went home, but these leaders then really entrenched themselves in Kabul, Sayoff, and it was really it was vicious in Kabul from 92 to 96. I mean, upwards of 50,000 people were killed, and
Wow.
many of those same leaders, and they stayed until 96 when the Taliban came and threw them out. But many of those same leaders were then returned to power in 2001. I mean, there's a real symmetry there, because they were in power between 92 and 96. It brought in the Taliban. You got rid of the Taliban, who were all former Mujahideen anyway,
Yeah.
and they threw them out. And then you got rid of the Taliban, and you brought back the same people who were there between 92 and 96, and they were again thrown out in 2021 by the time. I mean, it's like history teaches you nothing. It's you saw how they behaved when they were last in power. you saw the very same people, the corruption, the lawlessness. I mean, there was a lot of fighting as well, with different groups, and it was vicious. And yes, of course, the Taliban, Osama bin Laden was there, but they did not bring Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan. That was the Mujahedeen, the ones who were there between 92 and 96, and the one who actually went to Sudan to invite Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan was a member of SIOF's group. Now, SIOF was brought back to power in 2001 by the Americans, to
Oh,
be
wow.
clear. And Haji Qadir, again, all these names and that nobody would know. But anyway, Haji Qadir, who would later be a minister in the US-backed government post-Taliban, post-2001, Haji Qadir, he actually gave a speech at a luncheon welcoming Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan
Really?
in May 1996. So I mentioned all of this because, and that's not to downplay the alliances that bin Laden developed with the Taliban, but those alliances were first and strongest with the Mujahedeen, who were in power between 92 and 96. SIOF had the camps at Farmad, or had the camps at Daruta, at the border at Torkham. Khalis, who was seen as a U.S.-backed ally in 2001, including Haji Qadir. They had Al-Qaeda training camps in Farmada. They certainly protected a lot of them, even post-2001. So I just mention all of this, which is very confusing for people, but to say that it is not as black and white, and the good guys are not always so good, and the bad guys are not all completely bad. And unfortunately, foreign intervention into Afghanistan is never about Afghans. It's always about the requirements and needs of the foreign invaders. So in 2001, when the Taliban were thrown out, and all these people were returned to power, Fahim's Ahmed Shah Massoud was killed in the bombing 2 days before by Al-Qaeda operatives who blew up Ahmed Shah Massoud on September the 9th, two days before the 9/11 attacks. Strangely, and nobody has followed up, they were given chits to go to Massoud by SIOF, Abdul Rasul SIOF, who was an ally of Massoud's, but who was also very close with the Arabs, and who was very powerful in the US-backed government post-2001. So I think it's not knowing history and not knowing the histories of the people that you're allied with is very dangerous. And unfortunately, when the US-led invasion occurred in Afghanistan in 2001, people like what's his name? That were doing the negotiating, and they knew who these people were. They knew who was SIOF. They knew who was Fahim. They knew, and they said, no, we've talked to them, and we've told them that you're either with us or you're against us. So it was very intentional in terms of putting these people back in power, because they didn't know anybody else, because the US had and NATO had been away from Afghanistan, had not been involved in Afghanistan. So they just didn't know or didn't have alternatives
Right.
to these former Mujahideen who had been such a problem. Now, I know you don't edit it, but I need a moment. I need a moment
Absolutely.
to uh, what's his name? Zal
So,
Khalilzad.
okay, you got it. You got it.
Oh,
I'm impressed with your memory, by the way. It's just, I was like,
really?
this is such a like a
Are you
solid
really
breakdown.
are you kidding me? This is so it was Zal Khalilzad.
Uh-huh.
It was Zal who was there in 2001, who was a special representative for the US. Now, Zal knew every single one of those people.
Yeah.
And I remember saying to Zalmay Khalilzad, what are you doing, Sayof? Fahim? These, look at what they did to Kabul before. As a matter of fact, in 2002, there
Uh-huh.
was a big meeting in Loya Jirga, and it was the women who stood up and said, what are all these warlords doing here? These Mujahideen leaders,
Wow.
what are they doing here? Look outside. They destroyed this city. Why are they here? Those same people, one of them was Zalmay Khalilzad at the time, suggested she be sent away as an ambassador somewhere so she couldn't be speaking out. But of
Uh-huh.
course, he didn't want anything to happen to her. But he said maybe she should be appointed somewhere as an ambassador. And instead of doing anything with these warlords who had been such a problem, um, they put them in the front seat of this big gathering, and they made them even more powerful. I mean, the Americans sent in bucket loads of money in suitcases in the first days.
Wow.
All the American CIA leaders, they brought in bucket loads of money, and so it also contributed to the level of corruption, of course, when you're just handing over money to ensure that people do what you want them to do. So I'm just saying that
Mhm.
history should have taught us something, but because, as I said, foreign invaders of Afghanistan rarely, never mind, rarely, never, I think, and this is just my opinion, I have it's never about Afghans or Afghanistan for these invaders. It's about whatever their needs are, or would and I even say that's fine, but to behave in a way that doesn't even at least give something back to them, and imposes upon them these same people who had been problematic earlier, and to do nothing to stop them from behaving the same again. And then you're surprised 20 years later
Right.
that it's back as big of a mess as it was back in 96 when the Taliban came the first time, and the Taliban are coming back. One of the reasons the Taliban were able to overrun so many bases so quickly and is because people weren't invested in the government. Afghans weren't invested in a government that was so corrupt. I mean, it was just so corrupt. So you're thinking, well, do I risk my life, or do I, or do I take the money, and they were paying off some soldiers, and then the soldiers just left the bases, and or do I stay and fight? Well, people weren't invested because the government in Afghanistan at the time was so corrupt. And I'm not saying that some things didn't happen over those 20 years. Of course, kids did go to school, but it wasn't solidified because you didn't hold anybody accountable for anything. You didn't
Hmm.
impose, you didn't create jobs, or a manufacturing industry, or a base that gave people an investment in their country,
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm rambling now.
No, this is really fascinating the way you just described. Well, first off, again, I want to say that I'm very impressed with the way your memory works and the names that you just shared and the description of the events that have unfolded over the years. This is really impressive. I think one thing,
I've forgotten a lot.
but you've remembered enough, I would say. But one thing I just noticed from the last. Well, a few things I'd love to pick to to explore with you. But one thing in particular was I guess the lack of trust in the government, and maybe I would add to that the lack of understanding by the foreign, uh, the whether it be the U.S. or NATO, lack of understanding of cultural sensitivities, right, or not knowing what the society wants or not understanding what they demand.
Not
Uh,
caring. I mean, it
yeah.
wasn't rocket science to try to understand. You have
Mhm.
to care. You have to, you come in and you open up places in Kabul where you serve alcohol, and it's, we've liberated the Afghan. Well, Afghanistan is a rural country. It's mostly agriculture.
Yeah.
Um, Kabul is not Afghanistan. I mean, you have to have a desire to know a place, to understand a place, to know the people, um, to be able to respect
Hmm.
who they are. Now, imposing your way isn't necessarily respect, I mean, that's not, but it wasn't hard to learn, to try to understand,
Yeah.
to want to understand so that you can work with Afghans to find a way forward that works for them. But that wasn't never the intention. So it's not that, gee, they just didn't know the cultural ways. And
Hmm.
so, they tried, but no, that wasn't the intention to understand Afghanistan. And Rumsfeld, his name slipped my mind for a while, but okay.
Now we're back.
Rumsfeld, yeah, Rumsfeld specifically said, we are not here to nation build. And then, of course, that changed, and they were there to nation build.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you read, there's now, and I think it's good that at least now there are things coming out. But I remember in 2001, in December 2001, and I said this to Saul, and I said this to a friend of mine, after they brought back all these warlords, and I said, you watch, in another 15 years, 10, 15, 20 years, this whole place is going to go to hell in a handbasket. And everybody's going to blame the Afghans because they're going to say, look at those Afghans. They've been fighting for years. We don't understand all their conflicts. They're tribal. It's all their fault. And they're going to blame them. And really the U.S.-led coalition, NATO, and went in for their own reasons, understandable. It had been an attack. They had to be a response, or they felt they had to respond. But when you returned the same people who had destroyed the country in the first place, and knowing how and why they did it, and then you return them and say, we're not here to nation build, you clearly have no interest in Afghanistan.
Right.
So whether you don't understand their cultural ways, sure, but you have no interest in Afghanistan. That, I think, has to be also said. There wasn't really an interest in Afghanistan or Afghans.
Yeah,
That's
and
my opinion, just mine.
the hot take. But what's interesting today is that you rarely, with any of the media outlets that people are constantly exposed to, you rarely find news of what's unfolding in Afghanistan or what's happening domestically in, I don't know, in Kabul or Kandahar or these other areas. And it seems like they're trying to maybe shift the focus away from, the botched withdrawal and the failure in Afghanistan and try to focus on other things. It's like, forget about it for now, and we'll deal with it once the situation becomes worse. That's how I see it, but I don't know if that's something, you have something to say about.
Yeah, well, I, I mean, the world is a busy place right now,
Hmm.
I mean, and so I don't know that there's a calculated here, let's manipulate what comes out. I mean, the news outlets are overwhelmed with the Middle East, with what's going on in Gaza,
Yeah.
with Ukraine. So Afghanistan, again, and I'm repeating myself, the invasion was never about Afghans or Afghanistan. So post-invasion, okay, it was a botched departure. But really, it was 2,500 soldiers. The way they went, a mess. But the fact that so many Afghans were desperate to leave,
Mm.
it didn't just happen in 2021 that so many Afghans were desperate to leave. And if anybody was ever paying attention to Afghans, you could have understood that this might be a problem. In 2019, 2 years before the Taliban made any move toward Kabul, Pakistan, a country that most Afghans don't even like,
Mm.
opened up its consulate in Jalalabad to give visas. There was a stampede of Afghans to get visas to get out of the country.
Wow.
And 9 people died in that stampede. Now, that
Oof.
was Afghans desperate to get out to a country they don't even like.
Oh my God.
So on August 16th, on August 15th, the Taliban came. Immediately, the social media among young kids was on fire with people saying, "Oh, get to the airport, and the Americans will take you. It's get to America. We could get to America." And so everybody went, and then plus all the foreigners were leaving, in a panic, even though really the US, you spoke with the Taliban for 2 years in Doha. You were negotiating with them for 2 years.
Mm.
And you had an agreement with them and everything. Okay, that was under Trump. Biden comes along. You're going through the same. They come into power, and the same people who were in Kabul were the people you were talking to in Doha. So why weren't you talking to them, before when they were coming in? Why weren't you, more prepared? It's far more complicated than those horrible scenes, which were horrible.
Yeah.
And that day it was, and I did a piece for a Substack on this 3 years ago, because I interviewed the families of some of the kids that were killed, like the young lad who fell out of the wheel well
Oh.
when he grabbed onto the wheel well. He was a young dentist. He was trying to get to America. His father is sure to pay, because his father had spent a fortune by his standards, to get him married.
Mm.
And he didn't tell anybody. And his father was sure that he was just so desperate to get to America to make money, to send
Oh.
it back.
Yeah.
Another young lad, he was a soccer player. He was afraid the Taliban wouldn't let him play soccer. So he thought, I'll go to America. I'm going to play soccer. He loved, and he got crushed under the wheels.
Oh
But
my
they were
God.
so afraid of the Afghans that instead of staying there and shutting down the engines and sending in people to disperse them, they took off in that aircraft. I still don't understand why, but I don't know all the details behind it. So, but when you had all these people hanging on to the aircraft, why did you take off? Why didn't you just shut your engines down? The place was, you had soldiers there, you had your people there. Disperse the crowd. They were just a bunch of Afghan. None of them had weapons. They weren't there with weapons. They were there just to go to America. You
Right.
know.
Right.
Um, but they were so afraid they just took off. I mean, and there was nothing on that aircraft. There was no one on that aircraft. It was supplies. It wasn't. Anyway, I mean,
Yeah.
and that's a question I don't understand, but I do think that there wasn't a lot of trust between the U.S. and NATO and their Afghan allies in Afghanistan over those 20 years. There was a report done in 2011, and
Mm.
it was the U.S. Army psychologist did this study of Afghan soldiers and American soldiers.
Okay.
This is 2011, 10 years before.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting study, because it says the American soldiers, they didn't trust the Afghan soldiers that they worked with. They said, oh, they're Taliban by night. They were with us by day. They go
Mm.
back to their villages. They're this, they're that. It was really very insulting. Equally insulting from the Afghan side toward their American and NATO partners, saying that we got substandard equipment. Our guns are always um, not working properly. They don't trust us, and really they're so rude, and they do this, and they won't drink anything in the market. They have to have their own water with them. They think that
Oh.
they're so.
Yeah. That.
This is not,
Yeah.
you know,
No, it's just
and that was before.
that was in 2011.
That's 2011, a
Gosh.
report that was, and where did it change? Did anybody say, wow, we really have to do something?
Yeah.
No, instead they just took the Americans off. There were no Americans when there was live fire,
Oh,
when they were doing their practice at the practicing ranges, the Afghan soldiers, the Afghan army, the Americans weren't allowed there if there was live fire in case
really?
they shot them.
Oh my God.
And
That reminds me of one of my good friends who was an Army Ranger, who was deployed to Afghanistan, I think twice. He told me something similar about this idea of perhaps unintentional or maybe even intentional segregation, where the Afghan army would probably not be having lunch with the U.S. military. So if they're sharing a meal, if they're having lunch, they wouldn't share a meal together. It felt like there was some level of separation between the U.S. military personnel and the Afghan. This comes from his experience as an Army Ranger. But he told me that he really wanted to establish a connection and sort of build a relationship, right? And nowadays, now that he left the military, now that he's in the States, it weighs heavily on him, this idea of leaving some of those people that he connected with behind, and those Afghan military personnel who were promised to be evacuated or promised to leave the U.S. but now have been left to leave Afghanistan, but now have been left behind. It's just such a very, very, very hard situation to deal with.
yeah, but it's a country of 40 million people. Um, you had 20 years to try to help, do things. It's a country. What are you going to do? Evacuate everybody? You know, it's like that whole evacuate. Yes, the military people. Fair enough. I say the military people, certainly evacuating all the CIA. There was CIA trained troops for Unit 01, 02, the Host Protection Force, because they were very and they had a tough job. I'm not saying, but they were very brutal. So there was a lot of and there's been stories done and real good investigative pieces showing the brutality of their behavior. These Afghan CIA trained forces.
Oh wow.
So a lot of anger among Afghans toward them, among Taliban. I understand absolutely. And I understand the fear that those who were with the U.S. Army fighting or in the battlefield, their need to leave. But there was no sense and I'm not talking about military, and I understand, and a person who had an Afghan that they got close to inside the military. There's a bond, and I'm
Mhm.
sure it's sad for them to wonder at their fate.
Yeah.
But really, everybody that after 2001, the world just evacuated everybody out of that country, and everybody who could left. That said, I mean, you could have been sweeping the garden or a gardener for somebody who was a foreigner, and you were taken out. What does that tell you? What you think of Afghanistan? Well, we better get everybody out. I mean, it's a country of four. It's a country. It's a beautiful country.
Yeah.
And okay, the Taliban rulers are regressive. And more hardline today than they were when they first came back in 2021. Um, but taking out everybody who maybe could have fought harder for rights for people, but you took out that sort of the teachers, the doctors, I of course, I mean, who am I to say, well, you should stay?
Hmm.
But it's a beautiful country, so okay, you're going to come out because I knew you. Well, I better get you out of there. Thank God you're in America. What does that say about Afghanistan? Well, thank God you're not in that, hellhole. It's
Right.
not a hellhole. It
Yeah.
is not a hellhole. It is a beautiful country, and Afghans are smart.
Hmm.
Afghans can figure out how to make things better. And I'm not saying that it isn't in a difficult place now, and there's some real problems, and and the Taliban are horrible in not allowing girls to go to school, and it's wrong, and they should be. And the vast majority of Afghans want their girls to go to school, including within the Taliban movement, who want their girls to go to school. But the leadership and how the leadership is set up. But the world abandons Afghanistan now, and all the embassies are closed. No, that's not true. That's not true. I lie. The embassies, there's a lot of embassies that are open. The Japanese embassy, there's something like 22 embassies that are open.
Wow.
The UN is still there. The World Bank sends people in. The IMF, not the IMF, sorry. Different UN organizations are represented there, which is good. The desire, in my mind, this is just again in my, the desire should be to get into Afghanistan and help Afghans find a way to make their country better, not shaming and beating people over the head and you're horrible and you're this and you're that. And I absolutely speak out in favor of girls' education. There are Afghans inside Afghanistan who are speaking out in favor of girls' education. There are women, young girls that are demonstrating in favor of girls' education. There are kids going to school in Afghanistan past grade 6 because Afghans are working to get them to school. There are people I know in Afghanistan who are running schools for girls. Is it right that they should have to do it in secret? Is it right that the Taliban bans girls from education? Absolutely not. Wrong. But standing outside and beating them over the head, does that make Afghanistan better or Afghans better? Does it help them? Or does it make you feel better? Like, this is, we have to beat them into submission. Well, this is seems to be the way, the only solution we have for anything is beat them into submission, beat the Afghans into submission, beat somebody else into submission, beat the Ukrainians into submission. That seems to be our go-to is, well, we just have to be, we'll show them they can't do this. What about getting into the country, going back? I don't say recognizing the Taliban, but there are a mountain of ways that you can get back into Afghanistan. Every single embassy could open in Afghanistan, putting people in there who can help Afghans know that they're not alone. Afghans will find their own solution. They're smart people. But I know that the world will come down on me and say, well, how can you say that we should go back when the Taliban are there? The Taliban aren't going anywhere.
Oh yeah, they're not.
And the opposition, the alternative, is no better because those people who say the Sadats, they are potential war criminals. The ones who were in power before, some of them are potential war criminals, and so if they're not so you want to put them back for the Afghans? Is that the answer? Maybe the answer lies with Afghans. Maybe they are smart enough, capable enough, competent enough. Let them figure it out. And unless you want to evacuate 40 million people, and then you have to figure out a way to help Afghans help themselves, because we don't have the answer. The West does not have the answer. The East does not have the answer. And you spent 20 years there. And let's be honest. What did we accomplish? You came in throwing out the Taliban in 2001. You left with the Taliban coming back in 2021. So you got involved in a civil war, you lost. Now, if you really want to help the Afghans, it seems to me you have to figure out with the Afghans. The Afghans, they're the answer. the West has its concerns. I don't say they don't. Pakistan does. There are militant groups there. The Al-Qaeda is regrouping. The Islamic State in Khorasan is there. The Taliban are fighting them. The Americans are working with the Taliban
Oh, are
to
they
try to
really?
fight. Well, I mean, I don't know for sure that they are, but yes, of course I think they are. Yeah, no, of course they are. I mean, because they were prior to 2021 in terms of going after Islamic State in Khorasan,
Mhm.
because the Taliban are opposed to them as well. In Kunar, the Americans couldn't do anything. They knew they needed to have the Taliban to go into Kunar because they had no ability. So on that, you're aligned with the Taliban. On that, you agree. ISK, you don't want them.
Mhm.
So, okay, there's allegiances among the Taliban with Al Qaeda folks. That goes back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Those links. Okay, what happens with those? The TTP, the Tehrik Taliban Pakistan, causing havoc in Pakistan on the border areas. The military has lost hundreds of soldiers on the border with attacks coming across the border from Afghanistan by the TTP. There are members of the IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan there. There's members from
Gosh.
the Uyghur, the Turkestan group, and a lot of other alphabets that I can't remember them all. But it's an alphabet city in there, the
Oh my
militant
God.
group. There is a real need to try to help Afghanistan and Afghans, because Afghanistan is more than the Taliban, and and you have to isolating them didn't work in the past. We saw that.
Mhm.
They were isolated when they were there between 1996 and 2001. And what happened? It became a haven for anybody who said they were had Islamic credentials. They ended up in Afghanistan. So it didn't help to isolate them then between 1996 and 2001. That led to 9/11. Osama bin Laden was there.
Right.
Taliban weren't part of it. There were no Afghans involved in 9/11. They were all Saudis,
Mhm.
and there was planning in Germany. I didn't see an invasion of Germany, but anyway, and no, I'm just kidding. Seriously, I
No, we know.
am. But so I'm just saying,
Yeah.
so realistically, everybody benefits if we work to try to figure out a way to help Afghans improve their country.
Mhm.
And it's not going to happen by making demands, do this or else, because what leverage does anybody have? None.
Yeah.
Uh, or okay, we'll stop the assistance. Okay, that makes it worse for Afghans. Poor Afghans become poorer. And is that what people want? So it's like, for me, finding a way to work with people, even people you don't agree with, even people you don't like, to make things better. You've got to figure out a way to make Afghanistan work for Afghans. Nobody wants increased migration from Afghanistan. I mean, a lot of the people that were evacuated still aren't settled.
Mm.
They're in between. I mean, really.
Yeah.
So you want to take out more people and do what? But how do you help them make their country work for them? How do you help them? And I don't have the answer, honestly. I really don't. But I do believe strongly the answer is not in isolation. It didn't work between 1996 and 2001 when they were last in power. You saw what happened. 9/11 happened. I don't say it's completely because of that. but when you're there, when you're in Afghanistan, you get to know people, you get to feel, you get to understand, you get to, understand how this works, understand how that works. And I don't say, people. One former diplomat said to me, "Well, we can't go back to Afghanistan because some people will become sympathetic to the Taliban." And
Oh.
it's like, really, really? I mean, the Taliban is like, they're not a monolith. There's a mix of different, I mean, there are people who want education among there. There are people who maybe they don't agree with you. Maybe they don't see their country run like America. Okay. But there are people among the Taliban who want a better life, who genuinely want a better life for their country and their countrymen.
Mm.
And there are those who want for themselves, I don't say, but there are among them. How do you work with them? And there's how do you work with the other 40 million people in the villages? People who have gone through the Soviet invasion and got nothing out of it. Then they went through the Mujahedeen and got nothing out of it. Then they went through the Taliban and got nothing out of it. And then they went through the US-led invasion and got nothing out of it. People, Afghans, they want a better life. They're not, and they're smart. The answer is in my mind, again,
Mm.
is to be there, not recognize fine, but to be there and to be in Afghanistan and to be among people and to show them that they're not alone.
Yeah.
And that will give courage to others, to people inside the country, to come together to perhaps find another way that works. It might not be what America wants or
Mm-hmm.
what Canada wants. I'm Canadian, by the way.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
so to be clear,
Clarification
but,
purposes.
but, should be very clear on that. But so it might not be that what looks like what we think or you think or America thinks. Well, so I mean, so what? We make a lot of mistakes in the West, and at some point you have to respect others, and
Mm.
and I think Afghans haven't been given the respect that they deserve. I really don't. I don't think any invaders have. I don't think most people do. I don't think they were trusted when in the last 20 years, many of the allies. I don't. I don't think it was much about Afghan, and I don't. Yeah,
Mm.
I don't think there's been a lot of respect.
Yeah. You mentioned twice, I think, that Afghan people are smart, and and I think.
Only twice. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, maybe I lost count. Well, you see, your memory
Yeah,
is way
sorry,
better
I
than
am
mine.
so repetitive. I am so sorry. I'm
No.
all over the place. I apologize.
No,
I'm
this
all over the
was
place.
I loved it. I mean, the fact that you have this level of admiration is in and of itself admirable, and I think that I've experienced many encounters with Afghan folks throughout my studies here in the U.S., and I think one friend of mine, Samir, who witnessed the fall of Kabul in 2021. I've never met someone as patient and as brave and as smart as Samir, and he went through hell, in trying to escape Afghanistan, since he was involved with he was with USAID. He worked for USAID, and he went to the American University of Kabul, I believe, or the American University of Afghanistan, right? And so I've recorded an episode with him, actually. I want to give him another shout out to just so people maybe go back and listen to his story. But again, I really think that there are so many of them out there who really want to make a change, who have went through so much suffering, and they really want to give something back to the country, because they'd hate to see their country crumble before their eyes. And so, yeah, it's such a that pushes us to want to really listen and help out and create or facilitate an environment where they can actually create that change because they really want to. And my
Yeah,
friend really
well,
wants to.
sure, the those who left, but it's I'm talking about the people who are still there,
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah.
Um, 40 million people are there. And I respect that, but I respect Pakistanis. I respect Americans too. I respect I'm it's not that I guess for me, I just see globally how we go into you the this going into a country and um imposing it's not just Afghanistan, and I'm not saying this right, but I think our arrogance
Hmm.
um, is Western arrogance is and it's Western, like somehow we know better and we'll and in our sympathy and our pity and our and for me, I say let them do it. I don't say abandon them. I say go in and but if they don't look like us, I mean, yes, the Afghans who left and so many are really struggling and want so much for their homeland, but those with beards and turbans are also Afghans,
Hmm.
and Afghans are also people in villages, and they're also older people who don't really understand what all's going on, and really don't trust us very much, and with good reason, and so Afghanistan is very it's like every country, I mean, I guess I'm not really making myself I'm not being very articulate, obviously.
No, I think you are.
But I do believe that regardless of whether it's Afghanistan or in any country, that we stop thinking that we have answers,
Mhm.
because we don't. But if we care and we have an interest and we have a desire to help Afghans help themselves, not dictate. And the truth is that well, military people were in danger for sure. And I understand that. Everybody who worked with an American or a Canadian were not in danger. Did they want to stay? Of course not. Who wanted to stay with them? It was a repressive, and a lot of people who wanted to leave hadn't even been born. They didn't know what the Taliban rule was like. They just all the stories and how repressive they were and how they
Yeah.
beat them if they didn't grow a beard and they didn't go to the mosque and if they couldn't play soccer and couldn't have music and couldn't have all of those things. But there were a lot of people who lived and survived and managed, and so I guess what I'm trying to say is that Afghans are like in any country, it's a mix. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't want to say anything about everybody who left. I don't want to say anything about, I just want to say that in my mind, unless you're there, and that to me is these meetings in Doha, these meetings in, I just want to say why, go to Afghanistan, have tea with a whole bunch of people, talk to them, try to figure things out, meet people, just be there. It will give people courage to, a lot of the reason when people left and they started to really, they were in a panic because every foreigner was getting on a plane and getting the hell out of there.
Right.
So it was like a massive fear. So, it was like wildfire that it was spreading. And then, I mean, they were taking out people who were like, play football, I mean, it, it, there were a lot of people who played football who couldn't get to the airport,
Oh,
or there were a lot of, girls who wanted to do things who couldn't get to the airport. Well, it just seems to me that And if I hear people say, well, we're going to really work to get them out of there. I think, really, really get them out of where?
Mm,
I mean, and it's that whole idea of if it's not the West, it's some shithole. Well, it's not.
mm,
And I and when I say about Afghanistan's a beautiful country, I mean that so sincerely. I also think Pakistan is a beautiful country. I mean, I think America is a beautiful country. I'm
mm.
not, but America is no better than Afghanistan, than Pakistan, than and so our arrogance really, I think, somehow um, makes us less able to really help people help themselves.
Yeah,
Anyway,
that's a
I'm not being very articulate, so I apologize.
no, no. I mean, I know it's almost we're 9 hours apart, by the way. For anybody listening to this, we're 9 hours apart. This is like what in the morning in the U.S. where I'm recording this, and Miss Gannon is in Pakistan. Uh, I think I think your experience, Miss Gannon, is very unique in a sense that you witnessed Afghanistan in the 80s. You've witnessed it in the 90s, right? And in the 2000s.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
things, first off, one of the things I want to maybe explore with you a little bit here is the idea of simplicity and how different the culture. Well, I mean, again, I mean, Afghanistan's very diverse, but I think generally speaking, there's some level of simplicity that the Afghans have that you probably wouldn't encounter in the West, whether it be Canada or U.S. or otherwise, right? I mean, there's something about this sort of lifestyle that's very that's maybe more community based or more collective in a way that
Well,
makes it a little bit interesting to sort of transition from a Western point of view to, Afghanistan maybe
well,
view of the world.
yeah, I mean, I come from northern Canada. I come from a very small mining town, like 600 miles north of Toronto.
Mm,
Um, and so very different than Toronto, for example.
yeah.
But yes, of course, Afghanistan culturally, it's a tribal based in many ways. I wouldn't say simplistic, like, we're much more complicated and we have a more nuanced understanding. And
Mm,
no, I mean, their opportunities are far less than ours. Yes, the culture is different. It is a tribal community, tribal oriented society, and the loyalties to certain groups and to people, and the sense of loyalty and how they define loyalty. Can be very specific to there. Um, and so of course, and the religion is widespread practice, Islam. But then, every religion, whether it's Islam or Christianity or Judaism, if you ask me, the thread is pretty much the same throughout all of them.
mm,
How each your practice will change. You've got some fundamentalist Christian communities that, don't allow dancing, don't allow singing. There's, restrictions. Um, you've got beliefs and same in other religions. So I don't touch the religious angle on anything because it's practiced differently everywhere. Each one practices the religion and in a different way. So I don't find, of course, as a woman, I find restrictions that I wouldn't find in, say, Canada, in some places. But at the same time, I see how laws are so flexible in America in terms of women's rights, and I think sometimes when I think how far maybe we think we've progressed in the West, how little we have. And I feel upset about that. So yes, of course, and I'm not trying to play down the fact that yes, of course, there are cultural differences, and but I guess for me, I don't. I yes, it's different. So
Hmm.
what? I
Yeah.
mean, and it's not that I'm that shallow or anything, but I mean, but really, I mean, it's like we focus in on, well, it must be horrible being a woman. What do you think? Wait, of course it's not. I mean, I yes, there are restrictions. I figure out, how do I get around them? Can I get it? Do I like or dislike? Sure, I have likes and dislikes about
Hmm.
about certain things. I have likes and dislikes about certain things that I see in America happening, and or in other parts of the world happening vis-a-vis women, and how um, we make, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, and I kind of think the stereotypes that are so overwhelming, even and so that's why I'm talking in circles, because I don't want to get into stereotypes, and I don't want to feed into them, and
Hmm.
but yes, of course the culture is different, and yes, of course but are they simpler than we are? No. And
Hmm.
they're as complex as we are, and have a political discussion with somebody, or their depth of understanding? Are there people who um, they can uh, talk circles around you, and talk circles around me, and understanding and philosophizing, and they might be in a village. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to play down that there are differences. Of course there are,
Mm.
and cultural differences. Are they simpler than us? Are they do they place more emphasis on family? Some people will say yes. I think yes, family and tribal connections are very important. Um, More so than in other parts of the world, less so than in other parts of the world. But Afghanistan is not a monolith, and
Hmm.
neither is Pakistan, neither is America. But we seem to want to put everything into a nice, neat box.
Yeah.
I
Categorize
mean,
things.
and especially outside of America. Well, they're this, and but no, I mean, I like them. Oh my goodness, no, they're good people, good people.
Mm.
But they're not quite. Well, they're not quite like us. I
Yeah.
mean,
There's always a but
and
in there.
huh? What are you talking about? At the and yes, there are differences, but so what? There are differences. Again, it's not that I'm so shallow, and it's not that I don't respond to restrictions, and it's not that I'm unaware of um, restrictions on women, and but also lack of restrictions on some. In some areas,
Hmm.
it is restrictive. You go to another place, and it's not. You we want to define nations. We want to, for example, and this is just an example, and I'm not attacking America, but
Yeah.
you have more killings in America, shootings. You during post 9/11, there were renditions, there was torture, there was thousands disappeared in Afghanistan without telling anybody. They were taken from their they were taken, and families knew nothing of where they were.
Oh.
Now, that does not define America. That and But if it happened in Afghanistan, that would define Afghanistan. You would say, look at that. What a kind of a country is that, for God's
Mm.
sakes, that they just pick people up and they don't even tell them. They torture them. What kind of people are they? But it doesn't define America. Well, I want to say the Taliban does not define Afghanistan. These warlords that were put back into power in 2001, they do not define Afghanistan. The person who shot me, he didn't define Afghanistan. Just as and I guess I resist this desire to characterize a nation, a people, a religion,
Mm.
and maybe I'm just too stupid. I can't characterize.
Yeah. No. I think there's something about the I think when I first proposed that idea that I wanted to explore, I think I sort of maybe tied it back to my society being somewhat tribal as well, Libya, and how there are things that I really like about the simplicity, somewhat simple, right? I wouldn't, again, it's hard to sort of, use you generalize, right? There are things that might still have simple elements to them, but it's somewhat of an advanced society. We have things that are do exist in the West, and we have things that do not exist. But there are instances where I feel like that it's more I'm more comfortable with that level of simplicity than the complication that I may encounter here in the West. And I'll give just a stupid, ridiculous example. When I was in Libya this past year, I just slept on a mattress on the floor. I didn't use a bed, and it's I think for a lot of people here, it's just so difficult to imagine how one would do that because they've always been, I guess from the minute they were born, they've always been accustomed to sleeping on a bed. But, for me, it wasn't something that I think I may have considered it a luxury, right? And
Mhm.
so there's that element of simplicity that I still, even though I live here in the West, I'm sort of, sometimes people would characterize me as westernized, but there are still, elements of where I come from that I like and enjoy. And it's just, yeah, that's the idea.
Absolutely. And the thing is, I guess also for me, what does westernized even mean? I
Mm,
mean, really, I think we take for granted the narrative of being westernized is this.
yeah.
What does it mean to be westernized? Does it mean to be arrogant and to be believing that you're entitled to take from the poorer countries? And make them poorer because the Western countries' consumption is so great. Is that what is Western? Is it rule of law? Well, does rule of law really work for your non-allies? Do you hold the same standards for others as for do you give the same freedoms to others and make the demands of all to behave the same? Is that what it means to be Western? So I think we take for granted because then I would say, I think we have to I, I'm 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 sort of at this point in my life where thinking that our narrative, we really have to rethink our narratives, redefine what we see as courage, what we see as bravery, what we
Mm,
we see as strength, and I think the West is really in many ways being less brave and less strong than many other countries in terms of insisting on rule of law, insisting on humanitarian law, insisting that all follow the same rules. So I think that there's one set of behavior that is okay for the West and everyone that is allied to the West, but there's a whole other set for
mm.
those that are not. And it's not a positive thing. It's a real I think we have to really examine that because there's a level of racism, there's a level of that is very deep. Look at when Russia went into Ukraine and the refugees that came out of Ukraine,
Mm.
and even some of the coverage was racist.
Yeah, I noticed that.
I mean, but they're civilized, not like Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, I was physically ill
Hmm.
when I mean, Iraq is the seat of civilization. So I'm not putting down one. I'm just saying I think that it is really important that we be as critical thinking about ourselves. And when we say Western values, when we say I honestly have no idea what that means. And I'm not saying that as but I honestly have no idea because you'll say one thing, I could give you an example 10 times over where that's not true.
Right.
You'll say another, I'll give you examples 10 times over where that's not true. So those values, you're right as a human being is because you're in America. I the right of somebody else who's in Pakistan. Well, that's all chaotic. That's this. As
Mm,
well, you shouldn't be doing that. You better not come here because you'll be like this. I mean, it's racist.
yeah.
So again, I'm not being very articulate,
No,
but
no.
I do believe that we have to be far more critical
Hmm.
of ourselves, or critical thinking far more critically about what we say so easily in terms of Western values, the Western way of life, the
Mm,
Western this, and that's not to demean anyone, because I do believe that America, of course, is a great country. As is Canada is a great country, but as is Pakistan, and as is Afghanistan, and as is Libya, and so I'm. Are there problems, and are there difficulties in each of these nations? Yes,
yeah.
but it's yeah. I'm again rambling.
This is no. This is really. It really makes me think more about the aspect of humility that I notice with a lot of these people that travel who have had experiences abroad, contrary to those that maybe did not have the same level of exposure. And here I'm not saying that those that weren't exposed aren't necessarily humble, but you do notice a sort of heightened sense or heightened yeah, so you notice that in the people that have had so many experiences abroad, they're very humble, and when you have conversations with them, it feels like they haven't like it's as if they haven't had that deep level of experience, whether it be in, I don't know, humanitarian work or war reporting or traveling or getting to know people. It's just you have conversations with them, and they're normal. And I'm not, and I know it sounds a little bit weird for me to say, but and it's just, yeah, it's very strange sometimes.
Well, but they're in their world, and I even say, okay, that is your world, and you're living within your world, and I accept that. And but I don't understand, what I of course I understand. It's the looking at other people and not being accepting of them, that somehow their differences are make them less. It's
Mm,
like, well, we all share a lot. We're more in common than we're different. Well, we're not. We're different. But that is good. That those differences are fun. They're interesting. They're problematic if you don't understand. It's a lot of work to try to understand. In just one country. I mean, in Canada, it's a big country. I mean, and so look at our indigenous, what we did. I mean, I come from northern Canada. I come from a place where in 1996 was the
mhm,
last residential school where we did horrific things to the indigenous children through the guise of the Catholic Church, with the help, rather, not the guise, the Catholic Church and the government of Canada. Horrible, horrible things to our indigenous people, taking them from their families, putting them into residential schools. That the last one closed in 1996. That
mm,
might seem a long time ago to you, but for me, I mean, I went to a Catholic school my entire time. I grew up in a small northern mining town. I knew nothing about this, and in in my very area that this was going on. So what does that say about Canada? What does that say about how we treat um, our Indigenous people, how we treat minorities, how we do? So is that a Western value? Gosh, what does that say about the Catholic Church that did horrific things that have been documented to these children? So what does that say about? So if you want to go down that road with Afghans or Pakistanis, or then go down that road with everybody,
mhm.
and understand that we really, none of us have that right to stand up and say, oh, look at you. we have the right to we should have the desire to try to want to understand better each other, not say be like me, but try to understand better each other. And uh, it gets into this whole, but
Yeah.
anyway, so I just feel that this whole polarization that exists today, particularly in America and really globally, there's an increasing polarization.
Mm.
And that, to me, only shows how more entrenched we're becoming to say our way, the right way, that the be like this. This is, this is good. This is bad. This black and white. This is courageous. Look at those going out and beating the hell out of this one. Look at this one. It's going. That's courage. And somebody who says show some compassion, and maybe we should, what's the matter with you, what kind of a weak person are you, and your leaders have to get into big trucks and blow big horns to impress the people.
Uh-huh.
If anything, it's becoming far more polarized, and that sense of strength and is the ability to be better and stronger than somebody else. And somebody's got to be the weaker and the loser.
Mm.
And I'm
Yeah.
going on again. Really,
It's
Abdullah.
No, this has really got me thinking about a lot of things. I hope you still have some coffee in your mug, because I don't know if this is gonna.
Not
Uh,
much though.
no, it's running out. You wanna? It's.
How long is this going on?
We can keep it going for a couple more minutes, because I sense with the time difference,
Okay,
it can, it's
no, I'm
nighttime in
just
Pakistan. What's that?
yeah. It's not that late in Pakistan,
Oh,
but
okay.
I'm rambling. I'm starting to ramble.
No, I love
Abdullah, so
this. It's
we need to.
Yeah, no, it's really I think sometimes when I talk to people who have had, I guess, a similar background as yours, who have been in these very dangerous situations, and who have tried to maybe make a difference or highlight people's stories, when I tell them that I admire your bravery, they would tell me it's the people who are brave. It's not me that's brave, but it's the people that I've interacted with, or that I've covered, or that I've listened to their stories. It's those people, and it just got me thinking about this, which ties back to what you were saying about the concept of bravery. It's sometimes, for me, it's just very difficult to define. I mean,
Mm.
I look at your background and your stories, and the one would be the experience of the person that shot you. And I think people who are listening to this might not be able to see your video, but you still have your arm is still healing, right?
It was forever like this. I have no use. So but I have wonderful physiotherapist and doctor who have made it possible for me to be able to use this mechanism. Helps me.
Yeah, because I was going to ask about because you can move your arm and your fingers. I was going to ask if that was something that because you can, yeah, because oftentimes I would think you might want to let it rest, but you can move it, and that's it's good.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I don't know what you think about yourself in terms of the experiences that you've had, and this idea of whether you consider yourself brave or not. I mean, what do you
Mm.
where do you stand on this? Like, I'd love to explore that with you.
Where do I stand? No, because I've been terrified at different times. I mean, like anybody, you get scared in a situation, and um, I'm I'm a few things. Uh, I find courage in the people that I do spend time with, and when I'm doing their stories and talking to them and being in the environment, and I find courage from them
Mm,
because I think, okay, this is, and I'm so grateful that people open up their hearts to you, and really in so many situations, honestly, Abdallah, I'm not sure I would. I
Yeah.
want somebody coming in and and then opening my door and after you've lost a child or lost many or survived an explosion or um, uh, um, have been away from your family for forever. And I mean, I've been, of course, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, but I was also in South Lebanon in 2006 for the war then. I was
Hmm.
in Central Asia, a couple of coups. I was in Iraq, northern Iraq, and I, I'm so grateful that I'm able to. I had those opportunities to be there to be able to talk to people, to hear their stories, to be able to report what was going on, and to try to help people see and understand. I guess. My friend who died in the shooting, Anya Niederinghaus, who I adore. We did some amazing work in Afghanistan together, and she's just wonderful. But she said she received the Courage in Journalism Award in 2005, and she said, I have to remember this quote properly, otherwise um, struck by lightning.
Let's hope not.
Is yeah, exactly. No, she said, she said, it's not about me being courageous. I'm not. She said, I report other people's courage. She was a photographer. She said, what I do is I report other people's courage with my heart and with my camera or
Oh,
with
I
my eye,
love
something like
this.
that. But it's true. And for me, it is. You're telling their story. It's not about me. And it's just, it makes me crazy when I hear reporters, oh, this is just so heartbreaking, and I feel so sad for. Who cares? Just tell their story. That I feel sad. Well, so tough luck. And I don't mean it that way, like but I mean it in that it's not about us as a reporter. It's about letting people hear their story. I did this. I'll just tell it real quickly because I'm rambling again.
No,
But I did
I
this
like
series
this. I
on
like
on
this.
honor killings, and I interviewed the brother who killed his sister.
A
Because
brother
for
who
me it was
killed his
really
sister?
his sister, yeah, and in honor killing. I did a series
Oh,
on honor killings in Pakistan. And my editor, who was wonderful, after I'd done it, and some people said, well, it's horrific. Of course, it's horrific, and nobody's trying to suggest it's not. But you 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 have to try to understand. I mean, that's the only thing we do as reporters. We ask questions. We ask questions to try to understand, so that the reader or the news consumer can understand better. And so, and the more I talked, and he talked about, why he did it, and people were laughing, and because she, was going to marry this one, and all his friends were, and he was being taunted. Not an excuse, not, of course, and nobody's trying to suggest that it was. But when my editor was going through it, and she said, Kathy, it's funny, of course, horrific, and it's not a suggestion that it's not horrific, but you sort of understand, we all have that sort of what people say. Well, it's
hmm.
not completely out of the realm of our all of our sort of understanding. And I believe so strongly that helping people understand doesn't make what happened right. And somehow we've lost this. We think that if we're trying to help you understand the Taliban, so you think the Taliban are okay then. So you like the Taliban, so that's what you're saying then. No, or so, whatever, something. But you should understand Russia's invaded. So you think Putin's not a bad guy. So you're trying to say that Russia. It,
It happens.
it,
People say
it's
that.
but it's the idea that you understanding is not saying something is right, or helping people to understand isn't trying to, it's not my job to make you hate Putin.
Mm.
It's not my job to make you love whatever. My job is to try try my best to help you as a news consuming person understand. That's it. You choose to like, not like, that's great, do. But my job isn't to make you hate the Taliban and be outraged. No, my job is to help you understand. If you're outraged, okay, that's go ahead.
Yeah.
But my job is, and that's what we do as reporters is, and we ask questions, and we ask them of everybody. And it's not he said, she said. That's stupid. People says, well, so Kathy, if somebody says the earth is flat, you're going to say, so Joe Blow said the earth is flat. With that, that's a lie. If you're going to just no, of course not. I'm not a stenographer. I mean, we're professionals. But why did that person say the world is flat? Who is this person that thinks the world is flat? And you ask the questions from that person. I mean, what makes you say that? So you understand? Okay, maybe there's a lot of people that think the world's flat. You think they're all idiots? That's fine.
Yeah.
But I'm curious. Why do you think the world's flat? Why are you saying that? And then you give context and but that's what we do. We're not, I'm not here to make you, laugh at the guy who thinks the world is flat, or say, look at Abdullah said the world is flat, and then move on to the next thing. No, I mean, I'm supposedly trying to help people see, well, oh, wow, or why. Instead, we want to hate somebody right away, or we want to believe they're wrong, or we want to believe this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, this is.
Yeah.
And it's increasingly so, I think, which is why the world is increasingly polarized. They're bad, we're good. They're wrong, we're right. And right can do anything, no matter how wrong it might do. It's still on that right category. And that and in my mind, it's because we're not telling and explaining, trying to understand, where we're instead trying maybe too much to make you like the right ones and hate the wrong ones, or hate, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I was this idea of
I'm again rambling, Abdullah. We're wrapping this up soon, I'm telling you.
Yeah, we've almost hit the 2-hour mark, so let me just try to wrap things up here with just one idea that I just thinking about it when you were talking about understanding and curiosity. I always think about these young kids, these wannabe suicide bombers, and I think about just really wanting to understand why they want to do this. Why do you believe in wanting to harm innocent lives? And why you want to keep on, why do you think that's right? And so it's always, for me, it's about curiosity. It's not approval of these actions. It's just wanting to understand them so that we can properly fix that problem. And so, and you might have so much to say about this, and I know we're doing almost 2 hours now.
But no, I because I've talked to would-be suicide bombers, and that, and like anything, there's no, one size fits all. And you're right. I mean, and the same reason why I talk to them, and because you want to understand, it doesn't mean that you're agreeing and, nothing. You want to understand. You want to understand the depth of their feeling. Do they even understand what's going to happen to them? Do they even understand what does it mean? I mean, and it's not just, to be very clear, they're not just, and it's not geared to any one religion, because, as we know, the first suicide bombers were in Sri Lanka, and so it's not tied to a religion, which is too often what is immediately put in there when we talk about a suicide bomber.
Yeah,
I'm not saying that there aren't a lot of them, but I'm just saying, but also trying to understand what their thinking is, and I interviewed this one suicide bomber, well, would be, obviously he didn't, otherwise I wouldn't have been interviewing him.
yeah.
But anyway, and he was just a young kid, and they had gotten him, and he was really upset that they had stopped him. And he was only maybe 14 or something. But he was so brainwashed. And, he'd gone to this school, a religious school, and he'd been so brainwashed, this poor thing. And he didn't, and he said, no, you don't understand. He said, the Quran says you have to kill Pakistani soldiers.
Oh,
I said, I said, because Pakistani was only created in 47. So, sure, yes.
oh my.
But poor kid, he didn't, he was a child. He didn't
Yeah.
know. And some school or and this is where I fall, of course, then you then get into following it up into religious leaders. And I'm not saying specific religion, and yes, with suicide, I mean, every religion has its religious leaders who have done horrible things. And, I mean, whether it's the Catholic Church, whether it's Islam, whether it's Judaism, whether it's and even Buddhism, I mean, so I'm not, and I know I do this all the time because I want to be very clear. Our world is so focused on stereotypes right now
Hmm.
and cannot think beyond these stereotypes. And yes, some within contribute to it, some, but mostly without. And so that's why I'm very specific always to try to be broader in my outlook rather than focusing, because none of it has to do with religion.
Yeah.
Religion is used for power. Religion is used for manipulation. It's used, and it's used by anybody who can possibly use it.
Mm. Well, that's one way of wrapping up our conversation, Miss Gannon. I think we went overboard. I should have at least asked you, hey, how long can you do this for? And I know you're traveling tomorrow.
No, it's fine. It's fine. But oh my God, I've just rambled and I haven't been very articulate.
No, no,
And
that was
I feel
great.
like
You feel like what?
I should apologize.
No, no, this was wonderful. I'm glad we did this, and I wish you speedy recovery, and I hope you'd have a safe trip as you travel tomorrow. And again, I really appreciate this
I'm just
conversation.
going. No, yeah, no, everything is good. I'm so fortunate. My battery's almost down, but
Oh,
I mean, I'm so fortunate, and yeah. Thank you very much. But no, I'm great.